Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm working really hard to reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. It's a truly important milestone for me. Please click the subscribe button on the channel. It's just one click, but it gives me massive motivation to keep making more videos. Thank you all so much. Parasites should know their place. The words struck the wedding hall walls like an empty glass hurled against marble. First the sound, then a silence that didn't drop suddenly, but seeped slowly, like red wine on a white tablecloth. I stood with a glass in hand, a smile that, a second before, had been genuine. Now it was merely a mask. The music froze mid-beat. Someone at table number 4 cleared their throat nervously. The photographer lowered his camera, as if afraid the lens might capture something no one would ever want to see. My mother-in-law adjusted her pearl necklace and looked at me with the same practiced smile she used to greet guests. Of course, she added lightly, as if it were a joke. I say this out of concern for my son. Laughter never came. I felt the blood pulsing in my temples, the fabric of my dress clinging to my back, the gaze of 120 pairs of eyes trying to decide if they were witnessing a social sparring match or a public execution. I looked at Michał. My newlywed husband stood 2 steps away. His face was frozen. I'd seen that look before, when someone said something inappropriate at a family dinner. It was the look of a boy who had spent his life learning not to interrupt his mother. "Mom," he began quietly. "What?" She shrugged. "Since we're toasting, maybe we should speak the truth. Michał always had a good heart. Too good. And you," she turned to me, "were lucky." The word lucky sounded like a diagnosis. Someone shifted in their chair. The clinking of cutlery against plates could be heard, people not knowing what to do with their hands. "Maybe we should sit," suggested Aunt Basia, the most faithful guardian of family tensions swept under the rug. But I didn't want to sit, not because I was strong, but because if I sat down, I wouldn't get up again. This wasn't the first time I'd been labeled an outsider, looked upon as a project, to be assessed for compliance with their standards. I met Michał 3 years ago in a small cafe on Wilcza Street. He came in with a laptop, passing a man trying to pretend he had his life under control. I was working behind the bar. The first time he looked at me, it was as if he saw something beyond the apron and the order pad. The second time, he returned specifically for a forgotten wallet. The third time, he asked if I could sit with him after work. I didn't know then that his last name opened doors in this city faster than a credit card with no limit. And I had a rented studio apartment, part-time studies, and a list of bills attached to the fridge with a magnet. To his mother, I was a statistic, not a background, not an investment, not a name, a glitch in a spreadsheet. "I think we've misunderstood something," I said calmly, holding my glass at eye level. Because I thought this was a toast to love. My words didn't raise their volume. They didn't need to. My mother-in-law raised her eyebrows. "Of course, darling. Love is beautiful. But in marriage, responsibility, stability, contribution also count." Contribution. I felt something inside me stop trembling, as if fear had been just a thin sheet of ice that had just cracked. "I understand," I replied, "and I'm glad we're talking about this." I looked toward the guests. I saw sympathy in my friend Magda's eyes, embarrassment in Michał's cousin, pure curiosity in more distant acquaintances who already sensed they'd have something to talk about at Sunday dinner. Because, since we're talking about contribution, I continued, perhaps it's worth mentioning that the house where tomorrow's celebration will take place is mine. The silence this time wasn't nervous. It was heavy. My mother-in-law narrowed her eyes. "Notarized," I added gently. 6 months ago, Michał turned to me so sharply, he almost knocked over a waiter. "What are you talking about?" I smiled at him. "About the wedding gift for us." The truth, was more complicated. The house belonged to my grandmother. Small, outside the city, with an orchard full of apple trees, it had been my sanctuary for years, a place I kept secret until I was ready. Grandma bequeathed it to me before she died. I didn't talk about it often. I didn't consider property a currency in relationships. And I certainly didn't want anyone to think I was entering this family with a bargaining chip. But today, someone decided to pull out a calculator. "This is some kind of joke," my mother-in-law scoffed. "Michał would have told me." "Michał knew," I replied quietly. He looked at me, confused. "I mentioned it to you," I said. "You said it didn't matter, that we had each other." His silence was confirmation, and suddenly I realized it wasn't about the house. It wasn't about money. It was about power, about who had the right to judge, who had the right to speak publicly, who had the right to define someone's value. My mother-in-law placed her glass on the table with a distinct click. "Even if that's the case," she said coolly, "it doesn't change the fact that my son always had more to lose." My eyelid twitched for the first time. "In that case," I replied slowly, "perhaps we should give ourselves 30 days. In the hall, someone inhaled sharply. 30 days, she repeated, to see if I'm truly a burden. If in a month you deem that your son has lost, I will leave without scenes, without drama. I heard my own voice as if through water. And if not, she asked icily, then we will consider the matter closed. A second, 2, 3, and then someone clapped uncertainly, one by one, as if unsure if this was still theater or reality. Then another, and another. It wasn't enthusiasm. It was an acknowledgement of courage, or a desire to end the tension. Michał moved closer to me. "Why didn't you tell me it would end like this?" he whispered. I looked him in the eye, because I believed I didn't have to defend myself at my own wedding. The music slowly returned, as did the conversations. Someone tried a joke, someone poured wine, but I knew one thing. This wasn't the end of the scene. It was the beginning. 30 days. Enough time to show who I really am, or short enough to realize that in this family, I would always be a guest. I raised my glass a second time. This time, I wasn't looking at my mother-in-law. I was looking at the future, and I knew that in a month, someone would have to retract their words. The next morning, I was awakened by a silence. Not an ordinary, morning silence. This one was unnatural, as if laughter, the click of heels, even the creak of floorboards had been cut out. I lay still for a moment, staring at the bright ceiling of the guest room in Michał's parents' house. I had stayed here overnight after the wedding. Today, I felt like a tenant on probation. 30 days. I didn't know yet if it scared me more or gave me a strange sense of relief. I turned my head. Michał slept on his side, facing away from me. His face was peaceful, but his fingers tightened slightly on the duvet, as if even in his sleep something held him in tension. I saw in him yesterday the rift between me and his mother, between a grown man and a boy who had learned that it was safest to remain silent. I didn't wake him. I got up quietly. I took my dress, draped over the back of a chair, and for a second, allowed myself to look at it without emotion. Just yesterday, it was a symbol of a new beginning. Today, it was armor that needed to be shed. Downstairs, the smell of coffee filled the air. My mother-in-law was seated at the dining room table, impeccably dressed, as if the day were a press conference, rather than an ordinary morning after a wedding. A newspaper lay open, but I knew she'd heard me before I entered the room. "Good morning," I said calmly. She looked up from her glasses. "Good morning," she replied, but without a trace of yesterday's theatricality. Now, she was cool, matter of fact. "I hope you slept well." Sufficiently. A moment of silence fell. It was no longer dramatic, it was calculated. 30 days is a serious declaration, she finally said. I sat down opposite her. I agree. In marriage, one doesn't do such things on impulse. Not in marriage. One shouldn't publicly question someone's worth either, I replied calmly. Her lips twitched. I worry about my son. So do I. That surprised her. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Michał stopped in the doorway. He looked at us as if he'd entered a room with an invisible minefield. Can we not start the morning like this? He sighed. No one is starting, his mother replied. We are talking. Michał sat beside me, but I felt he was half a step away. Physically close, mentally caught in something he hadn't yet named. Michał, I began calmly. Do you remember our conversation a few months ago about Grandma's house? He nodded slowly. You said you had it, but you didn't want it to matter. Because I didn't want it to, I agreed. But that doesn't mean I don't have grounds. My mother-in-law put down her teacup. Grounds for what? For proving that you're not dependent. I met her gaze. Grounds for being a partner, not an appendage. The word hung between us. Michał rubbed his face with his hands. I just want this to end, he said quietly. It's only just begun, his mother replied emotionlessly. It was then I realized that for her, this wasn't a dispute about me. It was a test of control. Before noon, I packed a bag and left. Michał walked me to the driveway. Where are you going? To myself, I replied. He hesitated. To my home, I mean. I said calmly, but inside, everything was taut as a string. We're supposed to be together, he said suddenly, as if it were a deciding argument. I looked at him gently. That's precisely why I'm doing this. He didn't reply immediately. Do you think Mom will change in 30 days? No. So why? I smiled slightly. Because you can. It wasn't a provocation. It was hope. I got into the car and drove away before he could say anything else. Grandma's house stood quietly among the trees. The apple trees bowed under the weight of late August fruit. I stopped in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment without moving. Here, everything was real, without calculation, without judgment. I went inside and opened the windows. The air smelled of wood and old tea. On the dresser, Grandma's photo still stood. She looked out with that calm gaze that said, "Think first, then act." I rested my hands on the kitchen counter. 30 days isn't a punishment. It's space. Space to see who truly stands beside me. The phone rang an hour later. Magda, are you alive? I heard immediately. Yes. And the internet is alive too. I frowned. What do you mean? Someone posted a snippet of yesterday's toast. My heart skipped a beat. Who? I don't know. The video is circulating in several groups. It's blurry, but you can see and hear enough. I sat down heavily on a chair. What are they saying? Various things. Some say you had class, others that you made a scene. Typical. I closed my eyes. And Michał's family? Some have already posted comments with a caption, "This is a private matter." I sighed. This wasn't supposed to go beyond the wedding hall. Do you want me to come over? Magda asked. No. I need to think about this. I hung up and stared at the wall for a moment. The game started sooner than I planned. In the evening, Michał arrived unannounced. He stood in the garden doorway, with his hands in his pockets, as if unsure if he had the right to enter. I saw the recording, he said, instead of a greeting. And Mom is furious. I laughed softly. That's not an answer to the question. He moved closer. They think you embarrassed the family. Did I start it? He fell silent. I don't want a war, he said finally. Me neither. So what now? I looked at him carefully. Now, we give ourselves 30 days of truth. How is that supposed to look? We'll be together normally. Family gatherings, everyday life. No attacks, no provocations. If you decide I'm a burden, I'll leave. He frowned. Do you think that's how marriage works? Trial contracts? No, but I know how respect works. He looked at me for a long time. I love you, he said quietly. The word was sincere, true, but love isn't everything. I know, I replied. And that's precisely why I was most afraid. Because if after 30 days, it turns out that his silence will always be louder than my words, I'll have to leave with my head held high. Darkness fell. In the garden, small solar lights, which Grandma had once bought at a market, saying that light always helps one think, were lit. Michał sat beside me on the bench. He didn't touch me, but he didn't pull away either. The space between us was exactly enough for everything to change over the next 30 days. The first day was just ending, and I already knew the stakes weren't about a house, but about a future where no one would ever call me redundant again, and that if I had to fight, I'd do it with quiet resolve. But I would see it through. The third day began with a message, not from Michał, not from Magda, but from a number I'd saved in my phone, as home. You're invited for dinner tonight. Everyone will be there. We'll talk like adults. It was stylish, impersonal, and unsigned, but I knew who was writing. My mother-in-law wasn't threatening outright anymore. Now she was inviting. At first, I wanted to refuse. Then I realized that 30 days wasn't a time for evasion, but for testing foundations. I replied briefly, I'll be there. Michał's parents' house looked like a stage set for a play that evening. The lights in the living room were warmer than usual. The table was set elegantly, too elegantly, as if someone wanted to prove that absolute control was theirs. When I entered, the conversations died down for a second. Not dramatically, but subtly. That was worse. Oh, you're here, my mother-in-law said with a polite smile. I'm not happy. It's not good that you came. It's just a fact. Michał approached me faster than usual. Everything okay? He whispered. We'll see. At the table sat his parents, his sister with her husband, and a cousin whose eyes always held something between kindness and a curiosity for gossip. I sat next to Michał. I felt like a defendant who had voluntarily shown up for interrogation. Dinner began calmly. The weather, work, Michał's sister's vacation plans. No one mentioned the wedding. The tension was like thin ice underfoot. Everyone knew it was there, but no one wanted to test its thickness. Finally, the father-in-law cleared his throat. I hear the recording is still circulating. I looked at him. Yes, it's not conducive to a family atmosphere, he added dryly. I didn't publish it, I replied. My mother-in-law put down her fork. That's not the point. It's about the impression. What impression? I asked. By entering this family, you start with a show of force. Before I could answer, Michał interjected. Mom, it wasn't a show of force. Then what was it? She looked at him sharply. A heavy silence fell like a curtain. I spoke first. A defense. Her eyes shifted back to me. Defense against what? Against being publicly judged as someone who brings nothing to your family. The cousin raised his eyebrows. Michał's sister lowered her gaze. My mother-in-law sighed, as if explaining something to a child. It was about concern. Concern doesn't sound like a sentence, I replied calmly. Michał flinched slightly beside me. He hated confrontation, but I was starting to understand that the absence of confrontation had been his survival mechanism for years. Let's talk specifics, the father-in-law suddenly said. What do you want to prove in these 30 days? It was a factual question. It pleased me more than it should have. That I'm not a burden, I replied. My mother-in-law winced slightly at the word she herself had used a few days ago. And what if we consider it's not about a burden, but about fitting in? She asked coolly. Fitting into what? Into our world. That sentence was the key. Our world. Not family, not relationships. World. I looked at Michał. Is this your world too? I asked quietly. He hesitated. It's the world I grew up in. He didn't answer if it was his, and that hurt more than his mother's words. Dinner continued for another half hour, but the conversation didn't deviate. I felt this was a test run, a probe of my reactions. As we were leaving, my mother-in-law stopped me at the door. A home is not just an inheritance, she said. I know. It's also reputation. I looked her straight in the eye. Reputation built at whose expense? Her face stiffened. Be careful that this confidence doesn't become arrogance. And you, that concern doesn't become control. For a second, something more than coldness appeared in her eyes. Perhaps anger, perhaps respect, perhaps both. In the car, Michał was silent for a long time. You didn't have to be so harsh, he finally said. And how else? I laughed softly. She doesn't speak gently. She's my mother, and I'm your wife. Silence. I feel like you're pulling me in two directions, he admitted. It was honest, and finally true. I don't want to pull you, I said to him more gently. I want you to stand on your own where you believe is right. And if I don't know yet, I looked through the windshield into the darkness. That's what these 30 days are for. I returned to my grandmother's house late that evening. I sat at the kitchen table and opened a notebook that had been lying there for years. On the first page I wrote, though 3. What do I know? And underneath, it's not about assets. It's not about reputation. It's about who has the right to define me in this family. I added another sentence. If Michał doesn't learn to speak up, I'll have to speak for both of us, and I don't want that. I closed the notebook. My phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Don't give in. I saw everything. You're not alone. I frowned. Who is this? I replied. For a moment, nothing. Then came the answer. Someone who also sat at this table once. My heart beat faster. Someone from the family. Someone from outside. I stared at the screen as if it were about to display more, but no message came. That evening, I understood something else. In this story, I wasn't the only one judged at that table, and if someone had lost before, perhaps now they wanted me to win. 3 days had passed. 27 remained. And for the first time, I felt this wouldn't just be a fight for a marriage. This could be a fight for something much bigger, for an arrangement that had been in place for years and was just beginning to crack. Someone who also sat at this table once. I barely slept that night. The message from the unknown number echoed in my mind. It wasn't a threat, not gossip, but something worse. Proof that the story I had just entered had earlier chapters. At 7 a.m., I sent a short reply. Let's meet. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, my phone vibrated. Corner Cafe on Lipowa. Today at 5 p.m. Don't tell Michał. My heart raced. Why? The reply came after a moment. Because he's not ready yet. All day I wandered through my grandmother's house, as if it were a foreign place, though I knew every creaking step. I brewed tea and forgot to drink it. I opened the window and closed it a minute later. It wasn't about fear. It was about a premonition that someone was moving a piece on a board whose existence I had only learned about 3 days ago. At 5 p.m., I entered the cafe. The smell of coffee and yeast cake was almost absurdly ordinary. Students sat at tables, an elderly couple, a young woman with a laptop. In the corner by the window sat a woman around 40, with straight dark hair, an unadorned face, but with an attentive gaze. She raised her hand slightly when our eyes met. I approached. "Is it you?" I asked quietly. She smiled briefly. "Yes, sit down." Her voice was calm, too calm for someone who had just sent me an anonymous message. How did you get my number? I began. From Michał. That word hung between us for a moment. From him? Who are you? I asked directly. For a second, she hesitated, as if wondering how much truth I could handle. I was engaged to Michał 10 years ago. I felt the world losing its proportion. What? Officially, it all ended due to incompatibility. She leaned back more comfortably. And unofficially? I didn't fit at the table. She said it without bitterness. That was the worst. What happened? I asked quietly. I made a mistake, she replied. I thought love would be enough. That if Michał loved me, the world would adjust. Her fingers twirled an empty coffee cup. It didn't adjust. His mother's world never adjusts. It's created for a specific vision. I felt every word she spoke resonate with my own experiences. Why now? I asked. Why are you writing to me now? Because I saw the wedding recording. My breath caught, and for the first time, someone at that table didn't look away. I didn't know if it was a compliment or a warning. Did Michał know you were leaving because of her? I asked. She hesitated. He knew, but he couldn't object. That hurt. Not because it was an accusation, but because it sounded like the truth. Do you think he's changed? I asked, almost a whisper. She looked at me for a long time. I don't know. But I know one thing. If after 30 days you're still fighting alone, you'll leave exhausted. Those words hit me more accurately than any previous attacks. Not because someone had hurt me, but because someone had recognized me. What do you want from me? I asked. Nothing. Just don't let her make you into a story she'll tell as another anecdote about a girl who couldn't make it. We were silent for a moment. Someone laughed in the cafe. The espresso machine hissed with steam. The world went on as usual, and I was looking into a future that could have two endings. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked. Because I wanted to believe this time would be different. She stood up. And maybe it will be, but it depends on him, not you. And her? She smiled without humor. She doesn't change. She chooses. She left a card with a number on the table. If you need to talk, you know where to find me. She left before I could ask her name. Only after a few seconds did I dare to look at the card. Katarzyna, that was all. That evening, Michał arrived unannounced. I saw him through the garden window. He stood gazing at the house, a puzzle he couldn't solve. I opened the door. We need to talk, he said immediately. Agreed. He stepped inside. He took off his jacket slowly, as if delaying the moment. My mother said something strange today, he began. My heart leaped. What? That she wouldn't go through the same thing again. My face drained of color. Did she say it exactly like that? Yes. For a moment, we looked at each other in silence. I met Katarzyna today, I said calmly. His face paled. What Katarzyna? The one you were engaged to. Silence, heavy and real. How? He began. She wrote to me. Why? Because she saw the wedding recording. He leaned against the wall, as if suddenly short of air. I didn't want you to find out this way. And how did you want me to? He didn't answer. In that silence lay the whole answer. Is it because of Mom? I asked directly. He closed his eyes for a second. It was complicated. Complicated or convenient? He looked at me sharply. It's unfair. Unfair is sitting at a table and listening to someone decide if you fit. Our breaths shortened. I love you, he said suddenly. The same words as 2 days ago, but today they carried a different weight. I know, I replied. Then stop making this a test. I walked closer. I didn't start it. He took a step too. 1/2 meter separated us. And if I can't fight my own mother? He asked quietly, and finally said it. The truth. I looked at him longer than was comfortable. It's not a fight with her, I said calmly. It's a decision about which side of the table you want to sit on. Silence fell. In that silence was everything. The 30 days stopped being a contract. It became a countdown. And for the first time, I saw clearly that if he didn't get up from that table, I would have to walk away from the one we were standing at. 26 days remained, and each of them would weigh more than all the previous years. The 29th day came faster than I expected, not because time sped up, but because I stopped counting it like a sentence and started counting it as a process. In recent weeks, I had seen a version of Michał I hadn't known before, not the charming, confident one, away from his family's gaze, and not the withdrawn, silent one when he sat at that table. I saw his struggle, quiet, uncomfortable, real. The first time he interrupted his mother mid-sentence. The first time he said, "I disagree." The first time he left a family dinner early, instead of staying until the end for the sake of peace. These weren't grand gestures, but they were his, and that mattered. On the last day, the invitation came again. Dinner at 7 p.m. No emotions, no pleasantries. This time, I felt no knot in my stomach. I felt peace. Michał picked me up from my grandmother's house. When he got out of the car, he didn't look like a boy caught between a rock and a hard place. He looked like a man who had finally understood something. "Ready?" he asked. Yes. I didn't ask what for, because we both knew. His parents' house looked the same as it had a month ago. The same table, the same pictures on the wall, the same chairs arranged in a geometry of control, but the atmosphere was different, less theatrical, more watchful. We sat opposite my mother-in-law and father-in-law. Michał's sister wasn't there this time. This wasn't a family gathering. It was a reckoning. 30 days have passed, my mother-in-law began without preamble. Yes, I replied calmly, and she glanced from me to her son. She wasn't waiting for an answer, but for a decision. Michał cleared his throat. Mom, before we start, I want to say something. Her eyebrows rose infinitesimally. I'm listening. I felt my heart quicken. I didn't know what he would say, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to control the script. For many years, he began slowly, I thought that to have peace, one had to remain silent. My father-in-law looked at him with mild surprise. I stayed silent when I disagreed with you. I stayed silent when decisions were made for me. I stayed silent when someone left because they didn't fit in. The silence in the room was heavy. But I don't want to live like that anymore, he finished. My mother-in-law straightened her back. Are you suggesting I raised you wrong? I'm suggesting I'm an adult. That sentence cut through the air like a blade. I looked at him, not at her reaction, but at him, because he had just risen from that table. This isn't a test of my wife, he continued. This was a test of me, and I know now which side I want to sit on. My mother-in-law looked at me. And? Do you think you won? I smiled slightly. It wasn't a game. Every relationship is a game of influence, she replied coldly. No, a relationship is a choice. For the first time, I felt no fear in it. I felt balance. My father-in-law spoke, calmer than usual. And the house, is that still current? I looked at Michał. He nodded. The house is our space, I answered. It always has been. My mother-in-law narrowed her eyes. So you're staying? We're staying, Michał corrected. Her face remained impassive for a few seconds. And then something happened that I didn't expect. She didn't apologize, didn't admit fault, but she said, "Then I hope you won't disappoint." I looked her straight in the eye. Me too. It was our truce. Not perfect, not warm, but honest. When we left the house, the air was cool. Michał stopped by the car. I was scared, he admitted. I know. I thought if I stood my ground, everything would fall apart. He smiled slightly. It turned out nothing fell apart. It just stopped being comfortable. I laughed softly. Comfort rarely builds anything lasting. He hugged me. This time, without hesitation. Thank you for not walking away, he said. I didn't stay for the house. I know. You stayed because you saw me trying. We were silent for a moment, and then he said something I didn't expect at all. If you ever feel me going silent again, remind me of this evening. I won't have to, I replied. You already rose from that table. A week later, we moved into my grandmother's house. Not as an escape, but as a choice. The apple trees in the garden were starting to shed their leaves. The air was cooler, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was breathing fully. In the evening, we sat on the stairs in front of the entrance. Do you think this is the end? Michał asked. It's a beginning. He looked at me questioningly. Family isn't chairs arranged at one table, I said. It's people who want to sit at it by choice. He took my hand, and I knew one thing. When I raised my glass at the wedding that day, it wasn't about the house. It was about dignity. If anyone ever calls me a burden again, I'll smile, because I already know I'm not sitting at a table where I have to justify my worth. I'm sitting where I'm chosen and where I choose. If this story gave you even a little strength, leave a comment. I choose myself, because each of us has the right to rise from a table where we are not respected. If you know someone who is fighting for their voice right now, share this story. And if you want more stories about strength, dignity, and quiet courage, stay here longer, because sometimes one raised glass from obliteration. Thank you for listening to this story, created especially for the Tales from the Heart channel. If it touched your emotions, leave your mark, a comment, a subscription, or a thought, because that's how more stories are born.